Usually when you are looking for some kind of medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision, right?
Well, absolutely. It's very black and white.
Yeah, exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and, well, you know exactly what is wrong. It's binary,
Yeah.
clean.
Right.
But then you step into the world of human interaction. You try to figure out what your boss or like your partner or your client is actually thinking, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly useless. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely opaque.
Yeah, I mean, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You communicate constantly every single day, yet the data shows that human beings are notoriously terrible at it.
We really are.
You misunderstand colleagues, you accidentally escalate conflicts, and you harbor these fears about speaking up. They're wildly disproportionate to any actual physical danger.
Right, like that famous stat.
Exactly. The fact that most people genuinely fear speaking to a crowd more than they fear death itself, I mean, that tells you that something fundamental in our biological wiring is misfiring when we interact.
Which is, quite frankly, a huge paradox. And that paradox is exactly why this custom-tailored deep dive exists. Our mission today is to pull back the curtain on those hidden mechanics of human communication.
To kind of look at the gears turning underneath.
Exactly. The goal here is to shortcut your path to becoming a master communicator. Because whether you are trying to, say, read a room, or de-escalate a fight with a defensive coworker, or just survive a terrifying presentation without your voice shaking, you need to understand the machinery underneath the words.
And to map out that machinery, we are synthesizing a really fascinating stack of research today.
Oh, it's a massive stack.
It is. We're pulling from psychological studies on nonverbal behavior, active listening frameworks developed by Boston University, and conflict resolution mechanics from the Center for Creative Leadership.
And we also have physiological guidelines for mental health first aid, plus some great strategies for cognitive reframing from the University of Florida.
Yeah, so it is a lot of information, but we're going to distill it down to the absolute essentials.
Because mastering these invisible signals, it completely changes how the world responds to you. And you have to realize that this communication, it actually starts before you ever even open your mouth.
Long before.
The speed at which your brain starts interpreting someone else is just staggering. There's a Princeton University study in our materials showing that first impressions form in just 1/10 of a second.
Which is incredibly fast.
Right. In the literal time it takes you to blink, the person you just walked up to has already categorized your trustworthiness and your potential for aggression.
And that speed, it points directly to an evolutionary survival mechanism. I mean, your amygdala doesn't have time to wait for a verbal introduction to decide if a stranger is a threat.
It's like, are you going to eat me? Yes or no?
Exactly. It relies heavily on visual, nonverbal data. And this is actually where the famous 738-55 rule gets brought up.
Ah, yes. Albert Mehrabian's rule from the 60s.
Right. Which suggests communication is 7% words, 38% tone of voice, and 55% facial expressions.
Wait, let me stop you there, because people quote that statistic constantly at corporate seminars.
They do, yeah.
To claim that, like, the actual words you use barely matter at all.
And it drives researchers totally crazy because that is a complete misapplication of the data.
Right.
Mehrabian's rule only applies to situations where you are expressing feelings and attitudes, specifically when your words contradict your tone.
So not for facts?
No, not at all.
Hmm.
If you are teaching a physics class or giving someone literal driving directions, the verbal content carries the vast majority of the meaning.
Makes sense.
But when there is emotional ambiguity, say a coworker says, "I'm fine," but their jaw is clenched and their tone is super flat, your brain discards the 7% verbal data entirely. It knows the 55% facial and 38% vocal tone are the honest signals.
So if you are being judged that quickly and your nonverbals carry that much emotional weight, you really have to deliberately manage those signals.
You do.
And the materials from Mental Health First Aid offer some highly practical guidelines on how to physically lower your threat signature. Like, if you want to appear supportive, you don't just wing it.
Right.
You maintain comfortable eye contact, but, you know, you don't stare them down. You keep an open posture, removing barriers like crossed arms. But the positioning is what really caught my eye.
Oh, the sitting at an angle.
Yeah. They recommend sitting down, even if the other person is standing, and angling yourself alongside them rather than directly opposite.
Well, because standing face-to-face is biologically confrontational. It exposes the most vulnerable parts of your anatomy to a potential adversary.
Wow, so it's really primal.
Exactly. By sitting at an angle, you are removing that primal standoff dynamic.
Yeah.
You are signaling, hey, we are facing the problem together, not facing each other.
That's fascinating.
And they specifically note avoiding fidgeting, because you might just be burning off nervous energy, but to the observer's primitive brain, erratic movement signals either unpredictability or a desire to flee.
Both of which erode trust instantly. Okay, let's unpack this. Because a lot of these physical rules seem entirely dependent on where you grew up.
Oh, culture plays a massive role.
Yeah, the idea of proxemics, which was coined by Edward T. Hall, is essentially a social force field that expands and contracts depending on your cultural passport.
Yes.
In North America, the standard personal distance is about 18 inches to 4 feet. But if you interact with someone from a Latin American or Middle Eastern culture, that force field shrinks drastically. They prefer much closer proximity.
All right, they get right in there.
Conversely, many Asian cultures require a wider physical radius to feel comfortable. So if you don't understand those unwritten rules, your conversation just turns into this bizarre dance where one of you is constantly stepping forward and the other is retreating.
I've definitely been in that awkward dance before.
Right. So if we are naturally wired to send these biological signals, how much of this force field is raw biology versus, societal programming?
Well, what's fascinating here is how societal programming actually hijacks ancient biological hardware.
Okay.
Charles Darwin mapped this out in his 1872 work, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. He realized that our limbic system controls these involuntary physical reactions for survival.
Like what?
Take the universal expression of disgust, the wrinkled nose, the narrowed eyes. Darwin argued that physically evolved to block foul, potentially toxic airborne odors from entering the respiratory system.
To literally keep poison out.
Exactly. But today, if you sit in a meeting and someone pitches, say, an unethical business strategy, you will subconsciously wrinkle your nose.
Well,
Your brain is using a biological reflex designed to keep out poisonous gas to signal a rejection of a toxic idea.
that is wild. Our faces are literally playing out ancient survival tactics in the middle of a mundane board meeting.
They really are.
But, if our limbic system is making these snap judgments based on someone's posture or the slight wrinkling of their nose, how do you ever get past that initial bias? You can't just rely on your eyes. You have to intercept the transmission.
Right, you have to override the visual bias with auditory focus, which transitions us to what is probably the rarest skill in the modern professional toolkit.
True active listening.
Yes.
The Boston University framework in our sources makes a seemingly obvious point that is incredibly difficult to execute. Active listening requires far more listening than talking.
Which nobody likes to do.
Right. The core pillars they outline are paraphrasing, clarifying, reflecting, and summarizing. But they emphasize that you cannot do any of those four things until you dismantle your roadblocks to good listening.
And those roadblocks are sneaky, because they are the automated responses you use when you mistakenly believe you are being helpful.
Right. Like what?
Like the instinct to immediately fix the problem, or evaluate their choices, diagnose their psychological state, or, honestly, the most common one,
Hijacking the conversation.
yes, hijacking it by sharing a relatable story about yourself. When someone says they are stressed about a deadline, and you immediately say, "Oh, I know exactly how you feel. Let me tell you what happened to me last week."
You are not empathizing. You are broadcasting.
Exactly. You are stealing the microphone.
So to stop doing that, the BU framework highlights the mechanism of reflecting. And this isn't just parroting their words back to them, right? Reflecting means identifying the unstated emotion and applying a specific label to it.
Yes, labeling is huge.
Instead of just saying, "Oh, you seem mad," you level it up. You say, "It sounds like you are feeling patronized by that client's email," or "You seem entirely stymied by this project." You provide a high-resolution vocabulary for their frustration.
And the neuroscience behind that is just remarkable. When you accurately label a negative emotion, it actually decreases the electrical activity in the speaker's amygdala.
Wait, really? It physically calms their brain?
It does. By giving them the exact word for their feeling, they no longer have to expend all this energy trying to force you to understand how upset they are. It calms their nervous system down enough that they can finally start processing their own logic.
That makes so much sense. But the roadblock that seems the most insidious to me is the habit of mentally composing your next response.
Oh, everyone does that.
You see this constantly. People treat conversations like a game of ping pong. You stand at the edge of the table, paddle raised, hyper-focused on the ball, just waiting for the exact millisecond you can smash your brilliant point back across the net.
Right, just waiting to strike.
You are not building a collaborative puzzle. You're just waiting for your turn. So how do you actively shut off that internal ping pong player? It feels almost impossible when the stakes are high.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, shutting off that ping pong instinct requires a complete relinquishing of control.
Letting go of the battle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Active listening forces you into a passive structural role. You have to actively manage your own ego and accept that in this specific interaction, your primary job is not to prove your intelligence.
Or to win a debate.
Right. Your job is to act as an acoustic sounding board so the speaker can finally hear the flaws or the merits in their own thoughts.
That is a profound shift.
Yep.
You are essentially turning yourself into a tool for their cognitive processing.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And you are going to need that level of emotional discipline. Because once you understand nonverbal threat signatures and you know how to actively listen, you have to apply these mechanisms to the absolute crucible of human interaction.
The difficult conversation.
Yes. This is where theory collides with reality, conflict.
It's where it gets really messy.
The Center for Creative Leadership outlines 3 major errors you make when you step into a conflict. First, you assume you already possess all the factual information.
Which you never do.
Never. Second, you hide your true feelings, which pretty much guarantees those emotions will leak out later in passive-aggressive ways. And third, you completely ignore how your own identity is inextricably tied up in the issue at hand.
And the research on that third error is deeply revealing. They propose that a difficult conversation is never just one conversation.
Right.
It is always 3 distinct conversations happening simultaneously, layered right on top of each other.
Okay, lay those out for us.
First, you have the what happened conversation. This is the surface-level debate over truth, intentions, and who is to blame. Second, there is the feelings conversation. This is the unexpressed emotional payload, the anger or hurt that is actually driving the volume of the argument.
And the third layer is the identity conversation. This is the internal monologue asking, what does this conflict say about me? Am I competent? Am I a good person? Am I worthy of respect?
Precisely. And when your identity is threatened, your brain processes it with the exact same neurological intensity as a physical threat.
It treats an insult like a bear attack.
Exactly. So to bypass that, the materials suggest a tactic called starting from the third story. If you need to confront a colleague about a missed deadline, you do not start with your version of the facts.
Because that triggers their identity threat.
Right. Instead, you describe the problem from the perspective of a neutral third-party mediator. You point out the gap between the 2 viewpoints. You say, it seems you are looking at this timeline from a quality control perspective, and I am looking at it from a strict budget perspective. How do we bridge that?
So what does this all mean? Let's zero in on that identity layer, because honestly, it's the root of almost every bizarre office argument.
Oh, absolutely.
It is like an autoimmune response. The body attacks its own healthy tissue because it misidentifies it as a deadly virus. Like in a conflict, you argue with a coworker over who left the communal coffee pot empty.
The classic office fight.
Right. But you are not actually fighting over 50 cents worth of coffee. Your ego has misidentified their carelessness as a direct attack on your fundamental worth as a respected professional. Your identity feels bruised.
Exactly.
So in the heat of that moment, how do you actually separate your ego from the burnt coffee?
Well, it requires a deliberate, microscopic pause. You have to recognize the physiological signs of an identity threat in yourself.
Like the tightening chest, the flushed face.
Yes. And when you feel that, you shift your internal stance from, I need to deliver a message, to, I need to listen and learn. You remind yourself that the other person is also just trying to protect their own fragile identity.
Right. Maybe they see themselves as someone who is just too overwhelmed with crucial tasks to make coffee.
Right. And acknowledging that underlying identity threat, even just silently in your own head, short-circuits the autoimmune response. It stops the character assassination and redirects your brain back to the actual problem.
You are recognizing the hidden emotional stakes. And the CCL research actually provides a structural buffer to prevent those stakes from getting so high in the first place, right? The 4-to-1 ratio.
Yes, this is crucial.
If you maintain 4 positive, encouraging interactions with a colleague for every 1 piece of critical feedback you deliver, you essentially build up emotional equity. So when you finally have to deliver the criticism, their limbic system doesn't immediately flag you as a predator.
They feel safe enough to process the critique. It is preventative emotional maintenance.
I love that. Preventative emotional maintenance.
But, you know, everything we've discussed so far is anchored in one-on-one dynamics. The mechanics change drastically when you scale the audience up.
Exactly. You learn to read the room, you learn to de-escalate the ego, but what happens when you take that communication, put a microphone in your hand, and multiply the listeners by 50?
Most terrifying.
The stakes and the biological terror scale up exponentially. You hit the absolute wall of public speaking anxiety.
Yeah, the University of Florida research references that classic Jerry Seinfeld joke.
Oh, I love this one.
If people fear public speaking more than death, then at a funeral, you are statistically better off being the guy in the casket than the guy delivering the eulogy.
It's so funny, but it points to a severe physiological reality.
It really does.
To untangle that reality, the research distinguishes between trait apprehension and state apprehension.
Right.
Trait apprehension is a generalized baseline anxiety about communicating in almost any context. It's just part of your personality matrix. But state apprehension is entirely situational.
Right. So you might be perfectly comfortable arguing with 5 executives in a boardroom, but you experience paralyzing panic if you have to read a scripted speech to a crowd of strangers.
Exactly. But regardless of whether it is trait or state, the biological mechanism of the fear is the same. Your sympathetic nervous system detects 50 pairs of eyes staring at you.
And in the wild, being stared at by a pack of animals means you are about to be hunted.
Yep. Your brain floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol. So the UF guidelines offer very specific physical interventions for this. Like, before you speak, you can utilize isometric muscle relaxation.
Yeah, I found the mechanics of that fascinating.
Me too. You aren't just stretching. You are quietly clenching and then releasing specific muscle groups, your thighs, your fists, while just sitting in your chair.
Because your body has dumped fight or flight adrenaline into your bloodstream, right? You have to literally metabolize those stress hormones through physical exertion. Otherwise, they manifest as shaking hands or a trembling voice.
Exactly. They also emphasize arriving to the venue early. You don't want to rush in, spiking your heart rate further. You acclimate to the spatial dimensions of the room.
And you have those 15-second micro conversations with people in the front row.
Right. Forcing your brain to recognize them as distinct, safe individuals rather than this anonymous, predatory mob.
Those physiological tools are necessary, but the ultimate lever you have to pull is cognitive reframing.
Explain that.
Well, people view communication apprehension as a psychological failure. They think, I am nervous, therefore I am bad at this. But biologically, that fear is just an undirected surge of metabolic energy. It increases your vocal vitality, it sharpens your rapid-fire syncing, and it heightens your physical presence.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the standard advice you hear right before you walk on stage is always, just calm down, take a deep breath, and relax.
Which never works.
Never. I want to push back on that entirely. Trying to calm down during a massive adrenaline dump is like trying to stop a high-voltage power surge by plugging a toaster into the mainframe.
It's going to blow up.
Yes, you cannot politely ask your nervous system to stand still. It's like riding a wild horse. But if you route that electrical surge through a transformer, which is what cognitive reframing does, you can use that raw voltage to power up an incredibly dynamic, passionate presentation. You put a saddle on the horse, you don't eliminate the fear, you metabolize it into enthusiasm. Should we actually just stop trying to make the fear go away entirely?
This raises an important question, right, about the myth of the perfect communicator. The goal is never to achieve a state of Zen-like tranquility on stage. That's just not realistic.
Right.
The psychological objective is systematic desensitization. You expose yourself to the stressor until the fear becomes manageable, not absent. And if we tie this entire discussion back to our first segment on nonverbal communication, there is a massive reassurance built into the system.
What's that?
The audience does not have an X-ray machine into your nervous system.
They cannot see the cortisol in your bloodstream.
Exactly. They are entirely reliant on your outward nonverbal cues. If your heart is hammering against your ribs, but you deliberately plant your feet, utilize open gestures, and maintain steady eye contact, the audience's 1/10 of a second evolutionary scan will register you as the dominant, confident figure in the room.
Wow.
The invisible rulebook that judges you instantly can be weaponized in your favor.
That is an incredibly empowering realization. You are essentially hacking the visual bias of the crowd.
You really are.
Well, let's recap the terrain you've navigated today. You started by dissecting that 1/10 of a second nonverbal impression, understanding how ancient survival mechanics dictate the physical space and posture required to build trust.
Right.
You dismantled the internal ping-pong player, learning how reflecting emotions actually calms the listener's amygdala. You separated your fragile ego from the conflict by utilizing the third-story mediator approach to navigate the identity threat.
Yep.
And finally, you learned how to take the sheer biological terror of public speaking and run that voltage through a cognitive transformer, projecting absolute confidence regardless of your internal panic.
It is a really profound structural approach to human interaction.
It is. And it's important to remember that communication is not a talent. It is a mechanical muscle. It requires deliberate reps. But armed with the specific frameworks from these sources, you now possess the architectural blueprints to navigate the most complex system on Earth, other people.
And as you take these tools back out into your daily life, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We have spent this entire time unpacking how our physical bodies, our proximity, our eye contact, and our limbic threat responses shape how we decode each other's intentions. It is a deeply biological process honed over millennia.
Right.
But you are now operating in a world increasingly dominated by remote work, AI interfaces, and text-based communication.
Oh, that's true.
So if our brains require physical, nonverbal data to establish trust and regulate identity threats, how will our deeply evolved social biology adapt when your primary public speaking venue becomes a virtual avatar on a screen, and the active listener managing your emotions is an algorithmic text prompt?
We are stripping the biological data out of the connection entirely.
Exactly.
The diagnostic X-ray machine might be broken, but at least you now know how to read the shadows. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep analyzing those interactions, and we will see you next time.